In the 70s and 80s, the jazz scene in New York was in many ways very free and easy in terms of saying hello to musicians or meeting musicians or other fans. It was very active, and a lot of the older musicians that I've alluded to in other parts of these interviews, I did meet in clubs. And there were a lot of ways that could happen. I'll give you a brief example. Among the big name musicians that I knew well in New York, there was none that I was closer to than the pianist and vocalist Jimmy Rolls. And I'm not the only one. A couple friends of mine here in New York also were more or less proteges of Jimmy Rolls, and I absolutely consider myself a protege of his, and he would agree. He called me that himself a couple times here and there. But we knew each other well, and we played together and so on, and I recorded with Jimmy, I'm happy to say. But how we met was interesting, and happened, this was the way things happened. I'll give a couple other examples of some other things like that too. In this case, Jimmy was playing at a very famous club called Bradley's in the West Village. And Bradley's has been well covered in many films, books, and so on and so forth. It was oriented toward pianists, and mostly they worked there as duos, piano and bass. All the greats played there that were living at the time, and I won't even run down the list. It's just too many people. Anyway, the bartenders at Bradley's were a bunch of real jolly souls, and they were characters in and of themselves, and they would draw their own crowd. They were interesting people. And they would get around the music scene in the village themselves. A lot of the bartenders and night workers in New York at that time were musicians, or had been musicians, or were aspiring to be musicians. Anyway, a couple of the guys that worked there had come and caught this band, this widespread band, at a nightclub in the village. And so they recognized us when we would come into Bradley's. And one night I came in and had my horn. I was all dressed up after a gig, because Bradley's went till 3 o'clock in the morning, and that was just the music. The license was till 4, and if you were in there and Bradley Cunningham, the owner, liked you and knew you, or knew that the musicians knew you, he'd lock the door at 4:05 and just carry on. Who cared? It was nobody's business at that point. So often you'd walk out of Bradley's at 10 in the morning, and the sun would be up, and you might be feeling a little used up, even at my young age, let alone these older guys. Anyway, the bartender that I knew the best said to Jimmy, "Hey, this guy over here, he's really great. Why don't you let him sit in and play a tune?" So, Jimmy Rolls looks up from the piano, and I think it was probably George Mraz on bass. And, he gives the bartender a look like, he's not too thrilled. But, so he does the smart thing. He asks me to come up if I will play on the last tune of the set. Because if I'm no good, okay, I had my moment. If he likes me, well, I can play then in the next set a little bit, maybe. So he calls me up for the last tune of the set. And he says, and to picture Jimmy Rolls at the time, this is important. Jimmy, his voice and his manner resembled the famous director and sometime actor John Huston. His voice was remarkably like John Huston's. Deep whiskey baritone, lot of cigarettes, very resonant and authoritative. Not loud. And his manner, he had a white beard like Huston. He wasn't huge like Huston, but he had presence like John Huston. Very relaxed, very West Coast, and in fact, it was funny, at the time, he still dressed West Coast, which didn't fit in New York at all. His white turtleneck with a bolo tie. You could tell he wasn't a New Yorker, because by that time we were sharp. Everybody was wearing suit and tie, up to date, sharp looking. And he was obviously from California. But so he says, "Do you know Tangerine?" I said, "Yes." And he says, "What key?" I said, "A flat." All right. So, he went into his tempo and we played Tangerine. And he liked my playing, and he could see that I had a combination of influences which was genial to his style. So I played another set with him. And then we talked for quite a while, and again, there weren't that many young musicians around where the older musician could sit and talk about Johnny Hodges and Lester Young and Billy Strayhorn, and have the younger musician, in this case myself, be obviously what they call a live one. I was an eager audience. I was all too happy to hear all these tales of his youth and his coming up in music, which was fascinating. He was born in Spokane, which I guess is kind of middle eastern Washington state, hometown of Bing Crosby. And like everybody, I believe he was born around 1917. Like everybody of that generation who could afford it, he grew up listening to the radio. And he would talk eloquently about these summer nights with the breeze coming in the window and hearing the great bands and vocalists on the radio. And of course, that was his initial interest in music, like millions of other people. And there were musicians that played in Spokane. He would tell fantastic anecdotes about the Blackfoot Indian Nation up there. I don't know if there wouldn't have been a nation at that time, I don't think. But the Blackfoot Indian people up there. And his friend Don Brown, who was, according to him, was a pure Blackfoot Indian, played tenor sax, and was great. And they used to run around together, playing jazz, chasing women. Oh, Jimmy had some crazy anecdotes, which maybe this isn't the place for, just about being a musician in Spokane and then later in Seattle. Mostly talking about musicians that are lost to history, but also, of course, Seattle was a market for the touring bands, and I guess Spokane must have been too a little bit, but he didn't talk too much about the name bands playing in Spokane. There he would talk about the radio. And he was especially a fan of the Jimmy Lunsford Band, as well as Ellington, of course, among the big bands. And later in Seattle, and this is according to Jimmy, the Lunsford Band came to play in one of the big ballrooms to do a multi-night stand like they did then. And he said that the great pianist Ed Wilcox, who also was a fantastic arranger, I think he did arrangements that were, to my taste anyway, at least as interesting as Cy Oliver and some of the other greats who wrote Buster Harding for Lunsford. But Wilcox, according to Jimmy, was really a ladies' man. And after a couple sets, he'd had enough. He wanted to go hang at the bar and pick up ladies. So he knew Jimmy played, they had talked, and he realized Jimmy was a serious fan and probably a serious musician. So he said, "Hey kid, you know this stuff, you play a little bit, And they're probably, in those days, they were probably playing like half-hour dance sets or something. So if Jimmy didn't turn out to be too fantastic, it wouldn't have been any big deal, But of course, he was great, and the guys in the band, including the famous alto player Willie Smith, said, "Kid, you gotta get down to Los Angeles where you can get some action. You can work, So, as has happened again a million times, he took their advice, as they say, went down to LA, and he started to really work on the big time scene. And he says I believe one of the first people he met was the drummer Lee Young. Now, Lee was Lester Young's brother. And he didn't get all that far as a drummer because he was much more interested in management and music production. And he later, very interestingly, I think, became one of the key bookers at Disneyland. And he booked all this musical talent into Disneyland, including Gene Honeybear Cedric. And that was because of Lee Young. And I found this is all documented somewhere, but I found all this very interesting. So through doing some gigs with Lee Young and Red Callender, which I guess were trio gigs in LA, he got to meet Lester Young. And Lester picked him up, and he worked with Prez for a long time. And of course, this was very exciting to hear about. I'll just say one of the many things he said about Lester was that Lester said, "Call me Bubba," which had been his family nickname when he was in the Lester Young Family Band, because as has been well covered by the marvelous book, does the writer's name Kennedy? Oh dear, I'm forgetting. The Lester Leaps In book, which he covers Lester's early years, talks about his father and all that. But But Lester was very friendly and very protective of Jimmy, and they had a real good relationship, and they continued to work together and record together on and off throughout Lester's life, also through the Billie Holiday connection. Of course, if Jimmy Rolls is famous, and I think he is, a lot of it is from his close association with Billie Holiday. Not only the studio recordings, but I'm sure many of the people out there realize that Jimmy is the pianist on that notorious tape, the rehearsal tape, that, as often happens, stirred up controversy about whether it should be released or not. To me, there's no question. The participants are gone. There's no question that it should be released. Honestly, to me, there's nothing shameful or embarrassing on there. Just because Billy uses strong language, I mean, no, I don't think there's anything defamatory or negative about those. But that's Jimmy on there who's saying, lady, you ever play Violence for Your Furs? He's talking about, oh, that's an au fait tune, and they're laughing at him. I mean, it's a wonderful document, and I'm glad it was released to where people can experience it, because that's one of the things you can't get, really, from records or even from books, in a way. The ease, the camaraderie, the fact that these great musicians, they were colleagues and went out for a sandwich. I know that sounds silly, but it's important to remember. And these solos, these improvised solos, or Billie Holiday's improvised vocals that are classics, that was just one more pass in the studio. These solos that musicians like myself learned off records and treat as almost like a sacred text, that was another day at work. So in that sense, the jazz world historically is different from a lot of other music worlds that way, especially in some ways different from the European art music world. And jazz is an art music, and I've ended friendships with people who insisted that jazz was a folk music, and I get very upset about that. It does a disservice to folk music, and it does a disservice to jazz. Essentially, it's simply a mistake. It's an understandable mistake, because all musics emanate at some point from something that could be described as folk music. But that's not the point of jazz. Anyway, it's not really like Beethoven sitting down to do something monumental for the German people on the order of the Ninth Symphony, which achieves its goal. It's a human monument of musical greatness. Jazz musicians have produced things like that, but from a different point of view, using different kinds of tools. And of course, the tool here is so often is the fact that you can master something spontaneously. The fact that it can be recorded is almost just incidental. I mean, that's just something that happens separately. But I think it's, again, important to remember that those days and nights in the studio that produced all these classics, the people that did those sometimes went on to do something the next day, completely forgot about that session that they just cooked up. And it's documented by terrific people like Helen Oakley Dance and Stanley Dance, especially in their interview books. Give a great sense of the flavor of what those sessions were like. John Hammond, too, who were great witnesses to all that stuff. But a lot of those people were around during my time, too. And so through Jimmy, I got to hear wonderful stuff about Lester. He toured up and down the West Coast with Charlie Parker in the band that I believe included Chet Baker. And it was a rough time for Parker there. He was really having a lot of trouble. And again, even though I believe he was maybe even slightly younger than Jimmy, chronologically, he acted, according to Jimmy, very kind of avuncular, I suppose is the word, or in a fatherly way, telling Jimmy, don't get involved with what I'm doing, meaning heroin, because, he was using very heavily then, according to Jimmy, and was having a lot of trouble scoring. And it wasn't good. He was not in great shape. Jimmy said he played fantastically every night and was totally together on the bandstand and was very affable and sweet off of the bandstand, despite the fact that he was feeling very bad for a lot of his trip. And he said it was just blinding to work with Bird, and that when the first night he played with Parker, he was already nervous because he'd heard him, and he said, and after a set, Bird said, "You sound fine," he said, "but don't follow me." And Jimmy then explained, he said, because he said that because Bird would start a phrase that you would think was kind of a cliche, but he starts it in a completely unfamiliar place and on an unfamiliar interval, and he's going to resolve it, but don't follow him because you'll get led astray. In other words, what Bird wanted you to do was just play the song and be alert. Don't follow him because, again, his art is very modern, it's very abstract. He wants to create tension and anxiety by doing something that appears possibly to be wrong, like Picasso putting both eyes on the same side of the nose. Well, every child knows that that's wrong, but again, it's to create tension, it's to reveal an unseen world. And Bird, in his own way, was telling Jimmy about that, and basically trying to help him relax and realize that this unseen world, which was Parker's world of music, that apparently millions of us as listeners can share, because it is a real world as well as being Bird's world. But he was, coaching Jimmy, you can enter my world, but relax, don't try too hard. The door's open, you don't have to knock so hard, in a sense. So hearing all these things, was so priceless. And also, I was really a real protege of Jimmy in the sense that it wasn't just talk. He was living on Thompson Street with the marvelous and very underrated singer Carol Sloan, who also was as fascinating a person as Jimmy, and as intelligent as Jimmy, at least. She lives in Boston now with her husband, and she's been up there for years. But at the time, they were living together as a couple. And, I would come over and spend the whole day there. Jimmy's day started around 3:30 in the afternoon when he got up. And we put on his day wear at home was hospital scrubs. It was a riot. Even all those light green drawstring pants and stuff. Again, that West Coast thing, he was very easy that way. But, he would write out solos for me and make me do stuff like a student-teacher kind of relationship. And he would just suddenly just grab a pencil and music paper and say, oh, yeah, that reminds me of this. And he just, from memory, he'd write out this Ben Webster solo. Couldn't even remember what tune it was from. He called it Clinkers. I have some manuscripts around the house that he gave me of his song The Peacocks, for example. And so those kind of things were just fantastic. Also, other funny things would happen when I was hanging out at the apartment on Thompson Street. Just for one example, he had called up Norman Granz. And that's another person, like I mentioned Phil Schaap. Norman Granz, you cannot overestimate his importance in keeping the giant musicians of the so-called swing period, of the 30s and 40s, of keeping them in the public ear and eye, all through the 50s. He was recording not only artists who were at the time more cutting edge, like Charlie Parker and Dizzy, but he was also doing all those dates with Johnny Hodges, Billie Holiday, Ella Fitzgerald, Art Tatum, everybody. And keeping that going in my lifetime, he was doing Pablo records, which again, that series Live at Montreux and all this great documentation. He also documented a lot of those Montreux gigs on video, which are, Roy Eldridge, Benny Carter, who was also a mentor to me, which I will get into in another segment. But yeah, so Jimmy called up Norman Granz's office in LA, I assume, or no, Switzerland. He called up Granz's office and he asked them to please send him a copy of everything he's on Pablo, which was probably about a dozen LPs. Well, instead, they sent him the entire Pablo catalog, which, if you know what a standard hand truck looks like, it's about 5 feet tall from the ground. It was a stack of records that almost spilled over the top of the hand truck. It was like a 6-foot stack of LPs, which was hundreds. And he was in this tiny apartment. So he opens the door, he's like, Jesus Christ! And I'm there, Says, oh my God, he wasn't too happy, but so they just stacked the stuff up on the floor. He says, what do you want? Christ, take some records. So I helped myself to about 15 things. He said, wait a minute, no. That Art Tatum box, it was a 13 LP set of Art Tatum solo. He said, no, I'm saving that for Mike LaDon. Which he did, and he gave it to Mike LaDon, and Mike LaDon still got it, of course. And on the picture of Tatum, Jimmy writes a comics balloon, like Tatum is talking, and he says, look out, I'm coming back, Art Tatum. I know LaDon still has that. Oh, Jimmy Rose was a beautiful soul. Well, I'm on the subject.
Hulk, let's take a break for a moment.